Welcome to the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. Every week, you'll hear strategies for building your online service-based business your way. And now, here's your host, veteran freelancer, author, and TEDx speaker, Laura Briggs.
Hello, and welcome to the third episode in the reboot of my podcast. Now the show's focus is advanced freelancing. So if you haven't gotten caught up on that, jump back 2 episodes to hear more about why I rebranded this podcast and what the focus will be going forward. Today's show topic is the freelancer's quick guide to everything you need to know about working with startups. You probably already know that there are so many businesses started every single day. Now, the downside of that is that plenty of these businesses end up closing even before the end of their first year. And the statistics aren't good when looking at startups that last till even their 3rd or 5th year. You might have known someone or worked on a startup where the idea and the motivation was there in the beginning, but something went wrong in the process of bringing the startup to the vision of the bigger company, and ultimately things sort of collapsed and the company closed down. There are millions of startups that are out there, and some of them are successful, but a lot of them aren't. So should you work with startups as a freelancer? In this guide, you'll learn more during the course of this podcast episode about what it's really like to work with startups, whether it's recommended, and some of the things to be aware of when you are launching or growing your freelance business. As a freelance writer, I've been contracted by and contacted by plenty of startup companies, and I always go in as a questioner and a little bit cynical because sometimes the experience of working with a startup fades over time. So you go in with all of this excitement, you're thrilled to be a part of the team, you really believe in the idea. But one of the problems with startups is that they're at the point where they haven't fully tested whether or not their company is going to be successful. And it can be hard to build in a retainer or ongoing work with a startup if you don't know if they're going to be around. So in this episode, I want to go through some of the things that I have learned in the process of working with startups and some things to keep in mind if one contacts you or if you're thinking about pitching one. Now, startups, first of all, are more likely to post on job boards and job websites like Indeed. This is particularly true if they have a lot of funding because they might be trying to bring on employees quickly. Usually a startup is begun by just one person or a handful of people, and in order to scale quickly, they have to bring on employees in a relatively short period of time. So they're more likely than other clients to go the route of posting on monster.com or posting on indeed.com because they might be looking for a full-time person. Now, here's where it gets interesting. They probably don't have the money to pay for a full-time person. And a lot of traditional employees are nervous about working with startups because of the possibility that the doors could close in 6 months. So you might be in a really good position to pitch yourself as a freelancer working for a startup simply because they might have challenges attracting traditional employees. So sometimes you'll find them on job board sites like Upwork. Sometimes you can find them on LinkedIn. Sometimes they don't even have a website yet. So you're sort of limited into the research that you can do. You might come across a startup via a referral or someone else who tells you about something that's happening. But because they don't have websites and they don't have established business models, it's probably pretty unlikely that you'll find them in your own research. One of the things to be aware of too when doing research about a startup gets into my second point here, which is about their funding. So there's a big difference between revenue and funding. Now, working with companies that have ample funding from venture capital, or even when the founders of the company have put their own money into it, does mean that there's the possibility for you to get paid. So someone who starts a town lawn mowing service and is your neighbor down the street, like if you're an SEO person or a writer, they probably don't have the budget to hire you at the rates that you need to be paid, right? Because they're using their personal money to start that company. But when you start talking about venture capital and companies that receive millions of dollars from outside investors, it's easy to get excited because you see numbers like 10 or 15 or 20 million. Remember, that's not revenue. That is venture capital that's been invested in the company by people who believe the business has the potential to make revenue. That doesn't guarantee that the company will generate any money or generate a profit. So it could be something where this works in the short term while they have the capital to pay you. But if they end up in over their head and don't have enough money to continue supporting their cash flow and operations, you will likely be out of a freelance gig. So never equate the startup funding that a group or company has received as being the same as revenue. Now, revenue numbers of 10 or 15 or 20 million mean that is what the company is bringing in. They're actually selling things to people already. Some startups begin and are basically underwater from the moment they begin because they need that $10 million just to get things off the ground. But that doesn't mean they've even sold one item or unit of their product or service yet. So that becomes a very unsustainable company if they can't figure it out quickly. Now, the speed at which things will happen with a startup can definitely affect whether or not they have enough money to fund you. Some startups that are funded by the inside people who've begun the company, they will have very limited funds. They might be starting this business on $5,000 or $10,000, and they're hoping to hire you at $30 an hour because that's just all that they have available right now. However, let's say that's a really good business opportunity and it grows, you might be able to negotiate a higher rate or an increase at some point in time as they begin to bring in revenue. But as an outside party, you play a very small role in determining whether or not that company is going to be successful. So if the company doesn't end up making money, you're out of a job regardless of if they had great capital to begin with, right? So keep that in mind. Like, never count on these as a sure thing. There are so many different factors that can influence whether or not a business succeeds or fails. And the vast majority of small businesses started today will fail. So keep that in mind. Don't bank on that as your future. Don't take on a low paying gig that takes up 80% of your time with a company that might or might not have a solid future ahead of them. Now, point number 3 about freelancers working with startups is about management in startups. Some startups are completely mismanaged, which means they might have money now, but the company could completely close in 6 months. I have seen this happen more than once. I had a coaching client who was working with a startup on a very nice contract every single month on retainer, and she ended up parting ways with the client, and 3 months later, she learned that the business had completely shut down. So it just goes to show you the volatility of some of these startups. Other startups don't have enough funding to make it work, so your work is either on a limited budget or is few and far between. Those startups on that limited funding that they're using from themselves, or maybe they've cashed in their savings or pooled money together, will almost certainly try to get the most bang for their buck. Occasionally, you can convince them that the quality of your work is beyond what they're intending to offer, but that's not always a conversation where you will walk out a winner. In fact, sometimes these startups are just ready to hit the ground running, and, they are not going to perceive your work as being valuable just because they don't have the money or whatever mindset they're bringing into starting their new company. They might be under the impression that whatever you do is only worth $20 or $30 an hour. And how much of your time do you want to waste trying to convince somebody that they are wrong about the value of your services? So that's point number 3. You've got to watch out for the management of these startups. Sometimes you can have one person at the helm who is not that great of a manager, not that solid of a business person, and their leadership style and management techniques really drive people away. So you could end up in the situation where you end up wearing multiple hats within the organization because other people quit as the company is being founded. So you want to watch, what role and what piece of the pie are you taking responsibility for in these businesses, because you could set yourself up to fail. So one way to get more out of a company that you believe in that doesn't have a ton of a budget is to ask for a piece of the company. Think Shark Tank, right? So you're not actually asking for funding like the business owners on Shark Tank are, but you're asking for a portion of the company's future success. Now, the downside of this is that it's absolutely worthless if the company never goes anywhere. So if someone promises you a 10% stake in the company, but the company never actually makes a profit, or they make a profit like 10 years from now and you've negotiated out of your contract, that was essentially worthless. If it's something you really believe in, though, it can be a really good tool to get some additional money from a client that doesn't have the money to pay you up front. So I have completely done that before with a startup where the hourly rate they wanted to pay me was limited and how many hours they would give me was limited. But I thought, maybe I can negotiate for a future stake in the company that would stand, regardless of whether or not I'm still their content writer in the future. So remember, negotiations are always an option. You can negotiate far more than contracts. You can negotiate all kinds of details, and a stake in a startup could be one of them. An established company is unlikely to give you a stake in their business, especially if they're already a public company or already have stocks and all of that. That's usually reserved for high-level employees. But for a startup, they might be willing to haggle with you a little bit so you have a stake in the business without them having to directly pay you more upfront. Now, the final thing I want to dive into with regards to working with startups is kind of the hustle mentality that is present with a lot of startups. People who are highly motivated to start their own business, whether it's with venture capital or with their own money, often have the view that it's all hands on deck. And they, you hear this in interviews with successful startup founders years after they started the business that, they started in a garage and they worked 80 hours a week. And if it wasn't for, these 3 developers pulling nights for 10 weeks in a row, they never would have developed this app or this idea. So that mentality might not be the best thing to step into as a freelancer. If the idea is that everyone should be working really hard and clocking 60 to 80 hours a week, but you're not getting paid for most of that, or if you're getting paid a very little amount for all of your work, just be mindful of how that could easily take over your freelance business. It also borders on the line of what is a contractor versus an employee. If they're treating you like an employee by asking that you be available at certain times and controlling all aspects of the working arrangement, it's illegal for them to do that in the United States and pay you as a contractor. Because if you're essentially being in the role of an employee, performing the duties of an employee on their terms, that opens you to certain protections and or exemptions under federal law. So be careful of that you're not stepping into a role where you're being paid as a freelancer, but being treated as an employee, because you're denying yourself some of the federal labor protections, potential state labor protections, and that might not be the way you want to grow your freelance business anyways, because you kind of become beholden to this one really demanding client that wants everybody to be hustling hard and being available 24/7. If you're working for other clients, that might not be an energy and a schedule that you can continue to maintain over the course of time. Now, one of the fun things about working with startups is that energy and that mentality and that excitement that is there with the founders. I've worked with several startup founders, and almost all of them are in varying levels of distress and burnout because they've put so much into this company. A lot of them are way overdue in establishing the company or pushing the app or product or service live. And they're really desperate to get that going so they can start to see a return on their investment, both in terms of the time they put in, as well as any money that has been sunk into the business as well. So knowing how to interact with them can help you be more effective as a freelancer, being upfront about how you run your business and saying, hey, I can dedicate up to 10 hours a week to help you with your venture. We can reevaluate that in 6 months if things have gone well and things are picking up on your end. But setting those boundaries and expectations early on is really crucial to helping communicate with a person who probably has a lot of responsibilities on their plate. And that person is probably driven only by their inspiration and motivation. They put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this company. They have a vision for where it's going to go. But these early stages of a startup can be very overwhelming for a person who's kind of banked everything on this being successful. Because what if it's not successful? And it's a very tenuous period for a person who is the founder of the startup to walk it back and still be willing to continue with that same momentum when things are behind, or when they want to hire you as a freelancer, but they can't afford you, or when they have different expectations about what your working role will be. So if you can find a way to make it work for you with really good boundaries, it can actually be pretty exciting to work with startups. It's interesting to see how other people build their companies. One of the other things I'll warn you about, though, is that as a freelancer, you are essentially an entrepreneur. Even if you don't accept that title, you are a CEO and an entrepreneur because you have launched your own business. So when you have your own way of doing things, it can be hard to step into an environment where the startup might or might not have their own way of doing things. They might still be developing company processes and hiring procedures and all of that, or they might be really entrenched in something that the founders are bringing over from their other life, say as an employee or as an executive, and it doesn't really gel with your personal mindset on building a business. So that's why it's a really good idea to have a phone call with these founders to see why they created this business, what is their vision for the future, and how do they see you as a freelancer potentially fitting into that? Because sometimes you'll learn about other people's approaches and realize this isn't for me. This is not what I thought it was going to be. This isn't really what I wanted to work on as a freelancer. Maybe this is not a company that I should partner with. If you are going to work with a startup, make sure that you have some clear boundaries about what the expectations are. I've seen plenty of freelancers who've stepped in really excited to be on an hourly contract working with a startup, and then suddenly all 30 or 40 hours of their work week are devoted to working with this particular company. Before you find yourself in the midst of that, ask yourself whether that's what you really want as a freelancer. Are you willing to bet everything on this startup being successful? And if you give most of your working hours during the week to one particular client, are you still going to be able to do the marketing and business building that you need to be successful? If you lose that client and they were your number one source of revenue and income, and you haven't been doing any marketing because you've been so busy handling the work that they threw your way, you now have to go back to the drawing board and might have several weeks or even months where your income takes a massive hit attempting to recover. Another thing to be aware of in working with startups is that sometimes they like to hire people who appear to be a jack of all trades. So they might hire you to do content writing or web development or graphic design, but in that all hands on deck mentality, expect that you'll be able to jump into other areas of running the business. As the freelancer, it's up to you to speak up and say when this isn't working. I've had to tell clients before, I don't do graphic design. Trust me, you don't want to see anything I produce with graphic design. I do not have an eye for color or design, so it wouldn't help your business anyways, but that's not something I do. Sometimes they just, the founder thinks, well, I wear 15 hats in this business, so I'm sure you can too. And that's how that process begins of you giving away all of your hours to this particular client. So I'd love to hear if you've worked with startups before, and if you have advice, suggestions, or even concerns from working with startups. I'd love to hear those. Send me a note at info@betterbizacademy.com, and I might feature you or your insights or ideas and questions